There's a Impact JPAC tour using the buses that Forest Grove has on its special route. About a week and a half ago, they only had 5 people signed up, so I was told to bring as many people as I could. Well, apparently brought too many people. And so the list of people that will be attending from Oregon City, we still got 5 slots. Myself, John Lewis, Randy Smith, Carol Pauley, and Rocky Smith. I know, Rand. I was
not my brother.
Carol Pauley and Ryan from Finance will be going on that particular tour. Nice. The other thing is I'm going to have to leave what probably is going to be early tonight at 6 o'clock, so I was going to let the planning director chair go ahead and take over the meeting, if you would.
Okay. Well, the joint session between the City Council and the Oregon City Planning Commission is called to order, and we have a presentation of the Oregon City Sanitary Sewer Master Plan. Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you for being here and taking the time to listen, Mayor. I just let you know you're here for the best part of the night.
Yeah.
That's right.
John, I should to those people that I announced would go. We do have a carpool, so we get here tomorrow at 3:30, right?
Right. I think that'd be best time to leave.
Okay.
So again, thank you for this. I acknowledge the fact that this is a joint work session, and the City Commission has heard a lot of this information in the past. We're trying to be too duplicative, but this is the first time the Planning Commission's heard this topic, and so you get to hear a little bit of thing that has been mentioned before. I just wanted to acknowledge we started this master planning process in 2011, actually, so it seems like a really long time that we've been working through this, but we feel like a lot of that's got to do with the complexity of our sanitary sewer system and kind of the accuracy at which we were trying to get to with our sewer model. We've upgraded from what used to just be a spreadsheet model to a much more dynamic model. So we'll go through a lot of details, but our system is pretty complex. We've got 148 miles of gravity pipeline, 12 major pump stations, 6 miles of force main, 3,700 manholes, 9,740 customers. So it's definitely not a small system. And today we just want to summarize the master plan, highlight some of the findings, share some of the implications and recommendations as how we think we should proceed. Next steps will be take this to the city, to the Planning Commission for public hearings and adoption through that process, and then back to the City Commission for public hearings and adoption through meetings there as well. So really we want to provide a brief explanation of our approach. We want to talk a little bit about design storms and what that means, existing conditions versus future conditions. We're going to give you a little bit of information about some of the modeling scenarios that we did. Our main objective is to provide a detailed explanation as to the existing system deficiencies and what some of those fixes would be, what we see as the best strategy for managing the system as we move forward into the future. We also want you to recognize that this isn't just about problems related to growth. A lot of the problems that we have in the system are related to existing conditions. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then, I forgot, I'm sorry. So this is the slide I'm on. So we also we wanted to slip in some different information that's related but different with regard to an update on what we're going to do with SDCs and rates and some of the study work that's going on with that. And then we want to talk about the sewer moratorium, which we've talked to the City Commission about, and some of our implementation policy with regard to the moratorium. So hang on. So we are talking about not just existing conditions, but build-out conditions as well. And the city's done an outstanding job with some of its concept area planning. That's helped us to be able to incorporate those findings and those plans into our master plan. So I just wanted you to know that it's not just future conditions, it's full build-out conditions. Because of the topography and some of the problems that we're finding with our trunk and major infrastructure, urban growth boundary expansion areas are something that we're going to have to look to in the future. This master plan is based on a current urban growth boundary. So we've done a lot through the process. We did a lot of flow monitoring. We had 12 flow meters. We looked at pump station flow data at 6 of our largest pump stations. We, as I mentioned before, our previous model was a spreadsheet model, which was accurate, but definitely not as robust as what we have now. We did a lot of work to calibrate that hydraulic model, and I say we, it was really Brown and Caldwell. We looked at a lot of data, a lot of maps, a lot of comp plan data, a lot of existing development data, and we incorporate all that into that model. So while most of our problems are related to wet weather, we incorporated all those features into the hydraulic model, and it's all outlined in the master plan as to how all those numbers kind of affect some of our flows. We've got detailed cost analysis in our master plan, and we'll share some of that with you. And we've definitely made some assumptions based on how we should manage the program with regard to reduction of infiltration and inflow, which is rainwater that gets into the sanitary system. We are a separated system, so we've got a stormwater system that collects stormwater, and we've got a sanitary system that collects sanitary. And so we shouldn't see such high flows because there are two separate systems, but because we've got leaks in a lot of our pipes, we tend to see that inflow and infiltration make its way to the sanitary sewer system, and when that happens, it fills up, and in some cases overflows. All right, so setting a design standard is kind of like not taking on more than you can actually accomplish. So you could set a really high design standard and then find out that the capital improvements associated with trying to reach that are much more than you can support, or you can set them relatively low. DEQ has a 5-year, 24-hour storm event, and that is the size of the storm. Really, that's 3 inches of rainfall in a 24-hour period. That's the minimum that DEQ requires us to do. We looked at that storm, but we early on established that the 10-year, 24-hour storm event is what we should really be targeting for solutions and fixes. So we started looking strictly at the 10-year, and then we saw some of the results of that, and asked Brown and Caldwell to look at the 5-year, 24-hour storm event and see where the differences were. There weren't huge differences. But there were some differences. We also looked at existing conditions, so where we are today, assuming no future build out, and then really the ultimate build for Oregon City is future flow conditions. We definitely don't want to underbuild our sanitary sewer system and not look to the future. So we think that's a conservative but not too conservative approach. Other communities are definitely more conservative. There are some communities that look at a larger storm event for their design of sanitary sewer system. So we don't think we're too high with that. We also looked at what's an allowable backup in the system. So we've got some storage just within the system itself, where when pipes are at capacity, the system can carry a fair amount of water just within that. So we looked at what's an allowable level of full, if you will, and at what point do you exceed that level of full and start creating property damage. So we looked a fair amount of that, and when we looked at that, that's when we realized we got a problem. We were able to confirm some of the things we found in the field, and we've since brought back to the City Commission this idea of a moratorium. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Jim. It says, "Don't blame the messenger," but I think we didn't really confirm that we had a problem until we hired Jim, and so I kind of wonder if maybe.
So it is your fault then.
Yeah, I guess it is my fault. Well, thank you, John. So I want to start off talking about the results of the modeling, and we'll turn here to a map here that shows some of the problem areas that we've found based on the 10-year future condition scenario. So again, it's the 10-year storm. That storm is what we identify as establishing the level of service. That's what we want to provide in terms of sewer capacity for the city under that event. And it's basically twice the 1 in 5 year storm, which is the bare minimum that DEQ allows. So it's a good fit, I think, for the community. And as John indicated, when we look at the problem areas and we looked at the 5-year storm versus the 10, there are a few more challenges or a few more problems with the 10, but really not that many. So when you build to the 10, you're really getting a lot more benefit for your dollar.
So such as?
Pardon me?
Such as?
Well, we looked at the total numbers, the cost for doing the improvements for the 10-year event, and I think we'll show the numbers here in a few minutes, but it's about, in the master plan shows for upsizing pipes, upsizing pump stations, is about $5 million. And I don't have the number in my head exactly, but I think it's maybe $4 to $4.25 million if you design to the 5-year storm rather than the 10. So for that difference, you buy a whole lot more capacity and satisfaction. We can look at the exact numbers. I don't have those with me. So let's take a look at where we see surcharging and flooding. So based on that 10-year modeling. So let me define surcharging. Surcharging is when there's more flow in the pipe than the pipe can handle. Most of the time, that's not a problem because our pipes are deep in the ground, and if they have water that is 1 pipe diameter or 2 or 3 pipe diameters greater than the diameter of the pipe, you never even know about it because it's all underground. Surcharging becomes a problem when that number starts to get up around 8 or 9 or 10 times the pipe diameter. It starts approaching problem areas, which would be the ground surface. That's a problem, of course. That would mean flooding. We have sewage coming out onto the ground. But the more subtle area that you don't see is, let's say, when the elevation in the sewers reaches about 8 foot below grade. Well, that's when people have, with basements, and basement facilities, could start to see problems. We could start seeing sewage backing up in the basements once the water level reaches that height. And as John indicated, we've looked at that throughout the city, and in areas that we know that there are basements, we would tend to limit surcharging in those areas to a greater extent than in areas where perhaps there aren't basements. So that's a big consideration here, surcharging. So we saw surcharging and a number of different areas, and you can see in the red lines on the figure in front of you here where we see that surcharging. And so there's about 6 or 7 areas around the city you can see the surcharging. There are a couple areas that we would see flooding as well, and this is actually where we would see sewage coming out of the ground. Now again, this is under the future condition. This is with a full build out to the extent that's possible. So we see the flooding in a couple different areas. Hazelwood area, Lynn Avenue, and down in the Settlers Division. We don't have the names on them. Surcharging down around the Settlers Point pump station and the sewer before it connects to the Tri-City Sewer District sewer and Highway 213. So these are the problem areas. This next figure shows you where we've defined projects. And if you were looking at the master plan at these two figures, because they're directly out of the master plan, you'd note that the projects are not always as large as the problem areas, because when we fix some sewers, it alleviates sometimes the upstream problem. So if we can put a bigger pipe in at a certain location, the surcharging that we were seeing upstream of that really goes away. So this shows the northern half of the city, and you'll see again we've named some projects, the 12th Street, Lynn Avenue, Division, and 13th Street, a small project up on Holcomb Boulevard, and hopefully I can say it correctly, the Conema Pump Station upgrades there. What you also see here are the blue lines, which we're calling sewer extensions. And these are sewers that we've identified that would need to be constructed to provide service to areas that do not currently have service. So these are, in this case, for example, the Park Place, you see quite a few of the sewers. That would be to put sewers out into that concept area so that they could develop. And then other areas in the sewer, inside the city limits, where there just isn't sewer service currently. In some of the areas, that'll be to provide sewer service to where there are currently septic systems, because unfortunately, at some point in time, those septic systems will fail, and at that point in time, they'll need a sewer to connect to. We see more of those.
Could I stop you there a minute?
Sure.
And maybe you're coming to this, where we see those areas that are currently not in the urban growth boundary, the blue lines that you're indicating. I presume that future development will be taking care of some of that, but it has to be planned for. Is that right?
It does need to be planned for, and in terms of who pays for it, those projects will, we've talked about how that division would be broken out, but basically they'll either be paid for through system development charges or through direct development, directly by the development itself.
Remember those blue lines, because I'm going to come back to that. So
Okay.
those blue lines, we've got some decisions to make about how, they should be funded. At least the city commission does. Remember that.
So in the southern half of the modeling in this figure, the city, again, we have a couple projects identified. I think in a previous presentation we talked about Hazelwood, that area. And again, several more pump stations. There's 4 shown here: Hilltop, Settlers Point, Nobel Ridge, and Hidden Creek, that will need upgrades so that they can convey that future flow. On this side of the city, you've got the Beaver Creek concept area as well as the South End concept area. Extensive pipe system required there, with particularly on South End the need for a number of pump stations to get the flow up out of those low areas and back up to a gravity sewer. You can see on this side of the city that the hatched area, that's kind of a purplish hatch line, those are areas that are currently on septic, that I was mentioning earlier, that at some point in time they may need to go onto the sewer system.
Which ones are those?
They're
Oh, the purple?
The purple lines where they're all grouped together.
They're currently on septic.
They're on septic systems, yes. Yeah, there's right there above Settlers Point's a good example of that.
These here, I know.
That's a lot.
Yes, there are a fair number throughout the city's boundary.
Commissioner Roth?
I had a question. I'm seeing these names on the map, so I'll ask it now. Areas like Noble Ridge and Settlers Point seem to be very new to be having this type of a problem. And I'm wondering, why was the development allowed the way it
Yeah.
is, so that it needs to be upgraded? And have we done anything to change the calculations so this won't happen to us again?
Well, the Settlers Point is you raise a good point there. We think a lot of that Settlers Point capacity problem, in fact, we haven't developed a moratorium area around the Settlers Point area pump station for a couple reasons. One, we're working on a development agreement to fund the pump station improvements there. So the developer that's proposing building outside there is also proposing to front the cost of building those improvements. The other thing is Settlers Point is new enough to where we do kind of wonder about why the flows are so high there, and can we do something with I&I abatement to eliminate the need for a pipe upgrade. So I would say the design standards for those pump stations are right. There is some question about why they're at capacity, and that's going to take some more analysis in terms of flow monitoring and better pinpointing where the problems really are in that basin. So
Does that apply to Noble Ridge also?
Noble Ridge is it's a long-standing kind of pump station upgrade requirement that has been identified in the plan. I don't remember that being so capacity-driven as it is just O&M driven. So I don't think either Hidden Creek, Noble Ridge, the other one, Hilltop. Hilltop is interesting because the intent of that is sometime Hilltop will go away. So we've identified a project for the Hilltop pump station, but it's actually a gravity pipeline that takes it out towards Beaver Creek Road. So, some of what we're talking about here is capital improvements that are needed in the system, but they're not all they're not all capacity related. So we're mixing a little bit of this. This shows capital improvements, not necessarily moratorium related or capacity related.
Okay. But we are looking to developers in some of this because...
We are looking to developers on a lot of this, and I want to talk more about that later in the presentation.
So let's move on to capital program costs, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about what those cost components look like. So we've got basically about 4 different categories of capital improvements that we talk about. So we've been talking about sewer upgrades, and primarily this is driven by hydraulics. So where we have pipes that are undersized either for the existing condition or for the future condition, these are the pipes that we're talking about. They need to be upgraded to handle the flow. We've identified on the previous figures pump station upgrades, and John just clarified a point there that some of those are on the list because they're driven again by hydraulics. And Settlers Point is one of those, for example. Whereas some of the other pump station improvements that we've identified for to be included in the capital program are there because of needs to upgrade the facilities, not so much hydraulics. So that's the second category, the pump station upgrades. We then refer to something called an R&R program, which is basically rehabilitation and replacement program. This is primarily focused on the sewers in the system, and it's looking at the condition of the sewers. Unfortunately, sewers don't last forever. They have a pretty good life to them, and we often in the industry talk about approximately a 100-year life, but there's many factors that can reduce that 100-year life to a quite shorter life. And many of the sewers in Oregon City are actually quite old. I mean, some of the earliest sewers were built back at the early 1900s. So you've got sewers that are pushing 100 years old, if not older. Some of these sewers are not in great condition, and the city's closed-circuit television inspection program, where they go out and look at the sewers and evaluate the grade of those sewers, helps give us that information. So we have evaluated the inspection results that have been performed to date to identify a program to put money back into a capital program that will either rehabilitate or replace sanitary sewers that are structurally or operationally deficient. So you're basically reinvesting in those sewers that are starting to show their age. So that's part of the R&R program. Another part of that, and John has also mentioned or alluded to, because of the condition of the pipes, a number of the sewers see a high amount of I&I or inflow and infiltration coming into them, and often I&I far overwhelms the amount of base sanitary flow that we see. We talk about wet weather and dry weather flows. Well, we often see, and our flow monitoring has shown this, that our wet weather flows can be anywhere from 5 to 8 or to 9 times the amount of the dry weather flows. And it's all from water, rainwater, groundwater getting into the sewers when they shouldn't. So the focus here as part of the R&R program is to help take care of those sewers in terms of sealing them up or repairing those sewers so we can restore hydraulic capacity back to them.
Jim,
yes.
In your modeling, have you identified the locations where the most significant leaks are occurring?
We have, and in a very, let's say, general way, we installed 12 flow meters throughout the city. And generally, we install those towards the bottom of the basins. And then in addition to understanding what we get from the flow monitors, we had pump station data, which gave us even more information on the system. So we have a pretty good idea of where the worst basins are throughout the city. The next bullet that I have on my list is basically further I&I investigations. And this is where we would go back out and take an even closer look to evaluate where that I&I is coming from. Because when you look at a sewer system and how it's branched, if you put a flow meter at the very bottom of that system, and think of it like a tree, and you're at the bottom of the tree, you're measuring the flow, and you see how much I&I you have, well, you don't know what part of the tree it's coming from. So as you work your way up the tree or up the basin, you start looking at the different branches and monitoring the different branches. And typically what you'll find is that there are some areas that are much worse than other areas. And often that could be a lower area that's near a creek or near a very wet area where it has an opportunity to provide more inflow or infiltration into the system. So we have a pretty good idea of where to start and where to tackle it and where to go out and start a further evaluation to further fine-tune that.
Have you quantified approximately the percentage of increase during the wet season?
We have a table or several tables in our master plan where we identified the different basins and subbasins, and we've assigned values in there based on the modeling of what the dry weather, what the wet weather looks like, and what we call that peaking factor that relates wet weather to dry weather. So one can go into there and identify very quickly what the worst areas of the city are. Yes. So if you take those 4 different categories of capital improvements and put them into this table, again, you see the sewer upgrades, pump station upgrades, the R&R program, I&I investigations. One thing we did not mention was the private lateral replacement, and that's basically would be linked to an I&I abatement program where if you're starting to go out into the sewer system to seal up leaks in the sewer system, you really need to go in and look at the private laterals coming from the house down to the main sewer, because a lot of I&I gets into the sewer system via those laterals. So we've identified that as a potential cost, and I think the further evaluation is required before one can come back and assign what that cost might look like. So we've grouped the projects in the master plan in terms of when we would implement them, and what we're looking at here in this table is basically the funding that we would need to implement those projects. As you can see, we could take care of the sewer upgrades in basically about based on a funding of about $785,000 a year for the first 4 years.
Those would be the moratorium areas mostly.
Yes, it would. And that would take care of basically the sewer upgrades that are required to serve the future. And I've done a number of master plans, and it may sound like a big number, but relative to other communities, you really don't have that many problems at this point. So you're in a pretty good shape. Pump station upgrades. That's a longer-term program because they always need upgrades. So we've divided the cost in the first 4 years to address those that are particularly needing hydraulic improvements and some of the ones requiring upgrades to the equipment. And then that's a long-term program that you'll have to implement to keep the pump stations running up and keeping them reliable. The R&R program is based on the condition of the sewers. We're going to start off a little slower with that the first few years, but then that'll ramp up as the other categories ramp down, and that'll become your long-term program for managing and keeping the collection system in good operating condition. I would anticipate that you'll be looking at doing I&I investigations for a long term here to the point where you can start to manage the I&I a little bit better and have a little bit less I&I getting into the system. So we've identified that over the full 12 years of this planning period. So in short, you're looking at a program that's going to basically steadily ramp up over the next 12 years, starting off at about $1.5 million per year, then ramping up to about 1.7 and 1.9. And I guess, John, I should say that these numbers may change as you complete the rate study working with another consultant.
I might ask a question on the private lateral replacement. I imagine that's usually the responsibility of the property owner. But you identify a problem and they simply may not have the funds to deal with it at that particular point.
Well, that's one of the reasons we've deferred that one to a later discussion.
But it's deferred for 12 years, so that's why I was wondering.
I think, let me speak to that just briefly. I think as the city does more I&I investigations and determines where it needs to put money into the system, where it makes the most sense, I think as that strategy unfolds, you'll be looking at potentially, well, what do we do with private laterals? And every community in this state and in the Northwest that looks at I&I closely has had to ask that question. And there are a number of different models out there in terms of how that is funded. As you say, many of these folks, if you came to them with a $2,500 or $3,000 bill for replacing that lateral, have no way of paying for that. But a number of communities have come up with some creative ways of helping the homeowner fund that on the short term, with the community, the city ultimately being repaid in the longer term. And I think part of what the city will do as they look at that is look at perhaps what model works best for this community.
All right. So let's see. I'm going to get through this. We're half an hour into it, and we've still got several slides. So we've really kind of come a long ways with our existing programs. TV inspections, used to be we'd do TV inspections and we'd sit them on a video on the shelf, and we may or may not have taken action on them depending on the funding we had available to deal with it. Now we're doing a lot more with that. We're a lot more consistent with our TV inspections because most of it's technology. The technology allows us to do that. Allows us to provide that information loaded into our asset management system, and somebody here in the office can look at that. If they've got a question about a capital project or a road project, they can go in and kind of take a close look at that. Same thing with things like smoke testing and flow monitoring. We're definitely a lot further than we have been in the past. We've got a lot of room for improvement as well. So, that's why I think that some of the program funding is pretty important for us. We're refocusing our capital improvements for the most part. The city's been pretty focused on pump stations over the last several years, so invested a lot of money in its pump stations. They're very important facilities and costly facilities to upgrade, so that's consumed a lot of our capital in the past. We just talked about adoption of particular policies. Should we prohibit roof drains from being connected to the sanitary system? We are a separated system. We weren't always a separated system. So there are places in town where we separated the main pipes, but the private laterals, not so much. Private lateral sewer replacement program, again, we need to address that. We need to come up with those policies and regulations to figure out, what the city really kind of wants to do. I kind of do want to acknowledge a couple things. That this master plan update and looking at rates and looking at capital programs, looking at how to allocate those costs, that's been a group effort. We've gotten a lot of support from our finance department, our community development department, Brown and Caldwell, obviously, Public Works. Our legal team is helping us now with the moratorium. This is just a very big effort. The culmination of that kind of comes down to the rates, and I know there's a lot of interest in, okay, so what does this mean for rates? I think, as Jim referred to, I think there's good news there. It could be a lot worse, but giving you a specific number is something we're going to work towards in the August 12th. I think that's a work session. Yeah, work session. So I expect you all to be there for that, even though it's a city commission meeting. Even some of you planning commissioners might be interested in that. And I mentioned our legal team. They've been helping us through the legislative approval process of this thing, and Tony and his group have been very good. So we're going to move through several planning commission and city commission meetings to get this thing adopted and in place. So again, mentioned that August 12th meeting. I definitely don't want to spoil the surprise there, but a couple of things that I would say is our existing rates are not really aligned with our capital needs. So, we are going to have to, like our other utilities, we're going to share with you some of those needs. The moratorium that we're talking about and the process of implementing that puts us in a compliance schedule that kind of front loads some of the capital costs as opposed to spreading them over time. So that'll have an impact. A fair share of our capital improvements are not growth related. They're based on needs of existing development in our city. So how we allocate SDCs, for instance, and we're always concerned about the cost of SDCs. We're also concerned about rates. How we balance that is really what the rate study is going to help us work through and help you talk about. So keep that in mind. SDCs will also bring forth some recommendations there, but I think the big decision there is we've done a lot of work on these concept areas. Most of them are have not been developed because the infrastructure hasn't really been there, right? So how do we get that infrastructure there in a way that is well thought out, cost effective? Do we fund that using SDCs, or do we place that on the backs of the developers? Those are questions that I think we need to, that's a discussion we need to have and we want to share with you. We did a great job with the South End concept plan. There's some really upfront costs that, in sewer in particular, that before we can implement that plan, we're going to have to figure out a way to kind of get that sewer from the edge of the city to a place where it can go down the hill and to the treatment plant. So those are some of the discussions that we need to talk about, and we will on August 12th. So the rate study, really we're going to look into similar, for the City Commission, I know, when we did the water rate study. A lot of these things came up. A lot of question about revenue requirements. What does it really cost us to do an O&M? Is there a better way of doing that? What's our existing debt service? We'll be sharing that with you. What's that list of capital improvements? What's the timing of that list of capital improvements? Our rate scenarios, we don't want to go overboard with too many of those. I think we've heard good feedback from the City Commission about you tend to like steady rate increases as opposed to something that's going up and down and up and down, or even front-loaded rate increases have been a problem for this commission. So we'll want to bring that to you. We'll definitely bring you comparable rates from other agencies as well. I know we're a different city, but it's good to see what others are charging. So we'll bring that for you. Wastewater revenue is essentially a self-supporting enterprise. It's a little different. There's not too many options. Not very sexy to how you fund sanitary sewer. We don't have the same kind of innovative funding solutions that other programs might have. It's pretty much rates or SDCs. There are opportunities for loans, but we've got some limitations with how we can get loans as well. So,
What about grants?
not a lot of grants available for
Okay.
agencies our size. I mean, a lot of things used to be funded through federal government before. Those programs are no longer.
Yes.
Even on the treatment side, we see less and less funding available for federal funding. So anyway, we'll provide a lot of the details on the operations costs and the existing capital costs, and we'll go over financial policies and targets that, guys like our finance department, Wyatt, he's pretty much saying, you can't. You got to keep a certain amount in the bank. You can't spend those accounts down too far. So we'll be sharing that information with you as well. So we'll definitely evaluate our existing revenue levels and sufficiency and develop a multi-year rate implementation strategy. And we think we've done that before, and we've shared that information. We kind of know what you would like to see. SDCs, just a few things. SDCs, for those of you that don't know, are kind of a one-time charge for a development as that development occurs. We can't use SDCs for O&M kinds of projects. They're more for new construction and capacity-related new construction.
You said you
SDCs
can't, John, can you explain OM? What did you say it was?
Operations and maintenance, so staff, that the cleaning and inspection, those kind of things are a little harder to pay for. Those
So
are
you
considered
can't use
maintenance
that.
costs, right? You wouldn't
Yeah.
typically use SDCs for that. It's pretty much based on focus on capital.
On just strictly
Yeah.
capital, okay.
SDCs include both future and existing component costs. What's already built is what's versus what's yet to be built is something that we'll be sharing with you. And the last bullet item, a citywide SDC is preferred. There are some discussions that we'll have that, does it make sense to have a different SDC for one part of the city versus another? That gets pretty confusing
Yes.
and hard to implement. But, if that's a direction that we need to look at, we'll want to hear that from the City Commission. So again, August 12th, we've pretty much talked through this. I wanted to go into the sewer
Before you go to
moratorium.
that, John, so you're going to have this meeting on the 12th, and it looked like from the schedule you're asking the Planning Commission to have a first reading on the 11th.
Okay.
Well, that's what I saw up on the screen. So
Okay,
I'm
okay.
just trying to figure out timing and
Yeah, I
and
think.
how does
I
that
think-
How does that work?
well, how does that help us?
Yes.
On our,
Yeah.
I know it's only the first reading.
Yeah, and there is a difference between so if there's concern about, the Planning Commission, we're asking them to look at the master plan itself, look
Exactly.
at how that process was done, look at what the capital program looks like, not so much about how to fund all those improvements.
But we
And
may
so-
have people come and
Yes.
Want to talk about that?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly where my brain was going. It's going, okay, I know this is not what we're doing, but it doesn't preclude someone from coming in and going,
I think
well,
you can
we've
depend
been
on
there.
that.
You can
Yeah.
count on it.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Well, we'll try. We'll make sure we have staff for
Yeah.
those meetings that can speak to
Perfect.
that to
That's
the degree we
Yeah,
need
I
to,
think
because
that's a great
we can
point.
get really down into the weeds on a lot of the funding
Exactly.
piece. And
If
You know, I
you
don't know
could
how
be
far we wanna do
prepared to respond to that in your presentation.
Anticipation.
Yeah, because I remember when we first started talking about the water master plan.
Exactly.
That was like one of the hot items that everybody wanted to know is how's this going to get paid for?
Yes, yes.
So
For Warren, just for
the city's.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
There was a phrase used the other day at the planning commission meeting about moving the goalposts as it refers to the comprehensive plan. And of course, anything we do here has got a direct effect upon the planning commission's decisions for approval or denial of an application. So this plan that you're going to come up with, I presume is going to be made a part of the comprehensive plan so that we can refer to it in our findings pertaining to an application. It is just not a memorandum, it's something that's going to be official, that's going to have some weight. Am I right?
The master plan will be adopted by ordinance, and it will go through the land use approval process, and that, as far as I know, maybe Tony can help me out here, would be an amendment to the comprehensive plan.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine.
So, any more questions before I jump back
Nope.
into this one? So, the sanitary sewer moratorium, again, the city commission's heard a little bit about this, but there's basically 4 constrained areas, and the map shows them a little differently than that, but we're considering them 4 constrained areas. And those constrained areas are all experiencing sewer surcharge, in some case overflows, under a 5-year storm event, 5-year design storm event. So what we wanted to share with you was this policy. We know we're moving towards a moratorium. It's yet to be adopted. The City Commission will adopt that. Well, I'm assuming the City Commission will adopt that moratorium. That's the direction our legal team is helping us move through. In the interim, though, we've got this known problem with capacity constrained areas and the land use and building application process kind of moving through. So we felt like we needed a policy to start that implementation, even though the moratorium hasn't been adopted. So if you have some problem with this, we really kind of need to hear from you, because we're implementing it as we're implementing it as of last week, actually. So we're just trying to come up with a way to say to most development, or all development, if you're in these moratorium areas, your ability to build is constrained. We're not going to allow it. We might move it through the land use approval process, but we're not going to give you a construction permit to build your project if you're in one of these constrained areas. Everything outside the constrained areas, it's routine business as planned. So again, we're bringing back to the City Commission on August 6th the moratorium for believe, is that the first reading for the moratorium, or is that
That would be the first reading.
public hearing? Yeah. Thank you. And then, so in anticipation of the moratorium, we've got this policy, and we're going to go ahead and share that to you. But so far, for the Planning Commission's understanding, I'll go through these areas real quick, and I know the City Commission's seen these before. So our proposed moratorium areas are, I know it looks like more than 4 areas, but we're basically calling it Hazelwood Drive area, the Lynn Avenue area, the 12th Street area, and 12th Street, 13th Division Street area. And that impact is approximately 645 acres, about 11% of the city. Most of that's residential. The concern there is obviously pipe size. We need some additional pipe size. The other thing that I wanted to mention is of the area of developable lots located in the overall impact area is actually 64.2 acres. So we looked inside those areas. Even we looked at the basin and said, okay, here's the area that's impacting that. Then we looked inside the basin and said, well, here's the actual acreage that's affected, because they've got potential to develop because they're vacant, or a high degree of potential for redevelopment. Yeah, that's all I wanted to go over on that slide. Again, there's a little more detail. I know some of these are hard to read. We've got a lot of this information available online and in flyer format as well. And we'll be going over this, some of these, the sanitary sewer moratorium information and a couple other meetings, a meeting in July and in August. But so this is all related to deficiencies during wet weather flows. Surcharging, as we've talked about, is in areas that are 5 feet or less from the ground elevation. So we know we've got some basement flooding problems in some of these areas. If the problems aren't fixed, we're going to have spills, and that's definitely a state and federal violation. We know that the City Commission's proactive enough to where they're pretty interested in seeing it resolved too, even though that's really state and federal regulation. So until the capacity problem's fixed, we're going to see surcharging and probably overflows. So we think it's a high priority. So how do we implement a fair and straightforward way? So this is our policy. We basically, for land use applicants, we're notifying applicants that have come in. We're notifying them early. We're at the earliest opportunity that we can. We're trying to process those, or we plan to process those, and get them through our planning approval process. But we would leave them with a condition of approval that would say you can't really build anything until the capacity problem's been fixed. The building permits, we won't necessarily accept building applications. We're talking about full home, not additions, but a full home build, not necessarily the addition of a kitchen or bathroom. We're going to let those go through, but no applications for a full home build on an existing lot. No permitted issue until sewer capacity. So same thing there. We just really don't want to see those building applications move forward until we fix the problem in that particular basin.
One area includes the hospital.
Yeah.
Right?
So will there be any restrictions on that?
There will be. There will be. And so, that's the other piece about priorities. Where's our priorities as we move through the repair? It'd be nice to get those funded quickly and move forward with those in the most efficient way we can so we can get out from under this moratorium. So we're going to be talking a fair amount about that.
So John, one of the downsides of this is that obviously, I know you're aware of this, but land use permits have a limited shelf life. They don't last forever. So someone goes through the land use process, they have a 2-year period, we don't have the area fixed where they're in, and then what happens to their permit? I mean, it seems to me unfair that someone would have to go through the entire process all over again and have to pay additional fees.
Yes.
And that sort of thing. So I'm sure Tony has thought about this long and hard.
Well, Tony and Alita and our legal team have thought about that. The way we've set up this policy is that land use approval would be held and granted until a year after the moratorium is lifted. So
like a stay of some sort.
Right, like
Okay.
a stay of some sort.
Okay.
So, we definitely don't want to do that to our applicants and development
Okay,
community.
that-
We want to get them through. They would, I suppose there is some risk is if, today's regulations change, so they've gotten approved through today's regulations, but tomorrow's change, and then, they'll still have their approval. We won't necessarily go back and force
I
them
mean,
to
if you
make
don't
that
have
approval.
capacity, you don't have capacity, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that.
But
Right.
so
Right.
essentially, what our code says is that your permit's good for 2 years, and you can get a 1-year extension. So you have a 3-year time period to begin construction. We're going to reassess we're going to come back and revisit this and see where we're at relative to land use applications that may have been in one of these areas. Because essentially, we're going to have to come back and change the code. And if that's necessary, when we come back and review this, we will come back and make that proposal.
But it would only be for those specific types of applications, it wouldn't apply to everybody.
Correct, because they would
Okay.
have the one, yes.
Yeah, okay. Great, thank you.
I assume that you would at some point upon the adoption of this plan have a time frame that you could at least give a potential developer an idea when the area that they're talking about developing would be mitigated.
The plan talks about timeframes, like we saw the slideshow that was a recommendation, but we need to marry that up with our SDCs and our rates. If we don't marry that up with those, then the timeline of the master plan isn't what's going to drive us. It's definitely going to be rates and SDCs. So Yeah, and we're pretty focused on those capacity limited areas because we think getting out from under the moratorium is a pretty important thing for us to do and do it relatively quickly. So that's another conversation.
We'll have that information after the city commission sees the funding options to fix the problem. And after they select one, then we'll know exactly, and we'll be able to tell people that.
All right. I'm just thinking for predictability as far as
Yeah.
developers are concerned.
Yeah. No, it's important. And, if a developer comes in, again, we're going to notify them at their earliest opportunity and have a conversation with them about, where the status is. We'll know a lot more after we actually, have a decision on rates and adoption of the plan, all those kinds of things. But right now, it does leave them in kind of hanging a little bit.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we understand that's uncomfortable. Did I go backwards?
But those areas will be the priority, though. They'll be the priorities.
Well, I think we'll talk about priorities.
Yeah, we
Within
need
that.
to talk about priorities of
Yeah.
what that is. But generally, we're moving forward with the understanding that the moratorium areas are a priority. So we were just asking ourselves and knew you would be interested. The good news is we don't have a lot of land use or building permits in the queue that are in these areas. There's really 4 areas, and they're shown on the map. So there's really 2 land use areas. The property off of Warren Parrott Road was a 62-unit dormitory housing office building, which many of you, I think, are familiar with, especially on the Planning Commission. And then the other one is on Holmes Lane, which is near our Mountain View Reservoir, and both those are shown to your left. And then the other 2 are some building permits, one of which was right on the edge of a basin, and we're contemplating, depending on what that builder is really planning, it's a 4-plex, and whether, how aggressive he wants to move forward with that. Do we have options for diverting that 4-plex into a basin that doesn't have constraints on it? We're not sure if that's where he wants to go. The other one is pretty early in the land use process. There's some steep slopes concerns and some other things. We're not sure how far that one's going to go anyway. But those are I guess that's the good news, is we don't have a lot in the queue. So I think we figured you would be interested in knowing that. That's it.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any additional questions?
I do too.
Go ahead.
Well, this is kind of a different subject, but it's still approaching this. What is the effect of heavy traffic, heavy vehicles on the sewer systems in the streets, especially like in this neighborhood?
Well, most of our sewers are deeper. It would have to be a real shallow, I would say less than 12 inches to have an impact.
Okay, so like garbage trucks
And
things
typically,
like that.
we don't have sewers that shallow, so I don't think heavy trucks are a concern.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Actually, you had to come back to pump stations. I know we've had one in my neck of the woods lately, and then we had one a few years back that we didn't know about. The pump station wasn't receiving the water. It wasn't the pump station's problem. But how have we developed our monitoring systems to know the water that should be going through the system is going through the system?
Well, so both those, the scenario, which I think was near the Barkley Hills pump station, which happened a few years back, 2007, I
Yep.
believe. It's a lot tougher to find that kind of a problem where we've got a line blockage that's often some open space that nobody monitors. Those are harder for us to pinpoint. So the mechanism that we've done to remedy that is to make sure those lines that are kind of off the beaten path and not someplace that are going to be noticed, or we make sure they're on our quarterly line cleaning program. And that one there had pretty much gotten overgrown. It's hard to find the manholes even. So we think we've got a good program for staying on top of those kind of lines. The pump station problem that happened at the Paris Road pump station was a human error. We are pretty disappointed. We know that was a large spill, and something that's never happened. We've never had anything happen quite like that since I've been here, which is about 11 years. But we had an employee who was doing what he was supposed to be doing in terms of maintenance and troubleshooting the pump station. He made the serious mistake of neglecting to turn the pump station on and leaving the pump station. He also, when they do pump station maintenance work like that, he disabled the alarms, which is is a practice we're looking at as to, but it's pretty typical. But how we get notified of those disabled alarms, how often, how soon after it's been disabled should we have another set of alarms or triggers that go off. So two things happened, and really the disabling of the alarms was the biggie, because if he'd have left the pumps off, our systems are designed to notify. But if you disable the alarm, you're basically telling it to ignore anything like that. So pretty big problem. We've talked through that. We've taken some corrective action with that employee, and more importantly, we're building into our notification systems even more redundancy in how we deal with that.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Jim?
Thank you.
We will then proceed to the Willamette Falls Legacy Project Vision Document. Tony?
What's up?
Is this an updated version?
Yes.
Okay. Let's add that about 2 or 3 of those.
We keep changing that few words.
Okay, that's all right. I just want to make sure that, I don't have the, I want to have the latest and the greatest.
Only gets better every time.
Perfect. Oh, perfect. Well, the cover's different than the last version.
Pretty.
This will probably go pretty quick, so we can get to the next agenda item, right?
That's a request.
Because we got people waiting.
That was a rhetorical question.
So thank you. So we're here to provide an update on the Willamette Falls Legacy Project, where we're at. As you recall, when we started this process, there were 2 products that were going to be created. One was a land use document to deal with the zoning, the comprehensive plan amendment, a multi-use mixed-use, multi-use area, multimodal mixed-use area designation downtown. And so
Say
some of
that
the
again
larger
really fast.
infrastructure questions in zoning. And the second product was essentially the lobbying document. It was the document where we would capture the process that we went through, some of the more qualitative requests and vision that folks had that were really hard to put into a land use document. And so what you have before you tonight is the 95% draft of that plan. We have brought this to the partners group, and so really this document is to try to capture the public engagement process. Inside you'll see some of the design options that are there, the demonstration plans, how we move forward, some of the funding assumptions, some of the economic impact assumptions. And so, this is really a living document, and we'll continue to use it, but it is how we start and how we can now take this out and speak with one voice of what we want to see on the property. As we move through this, this is really targeted to the general public, other elected officials, especially at the state and the federal level. Obviously, our regional partners, we've contacted many of them, had them out on the tour from other local jurisdictions, but it would also be helpful for them as well. Neighborhood associations. When Christine and I are gone, this can serve as the document to help the next people who get to take on this project along the way.
I don't
Let's go ahead
think
and
so.
fire through this. So I'm going to walk through this pretty quick. So really, you've probably seen parts or some of these slides in presentations as we've gone through this process, and really this is a compilation of what we think is the best description of what's happened. So some of it has been brought forward from other presentations. It's really outlining the vision of what we want to see on the property, including not only the narrative component of it, but really the illustrative part of it, to try to capture what we heard from the public, what we've heard from the elected officials on what they want to see on the property. The site characteristics, it's a very unique site. There are a lot of amenities there that we've kept hearing about should be incorporated in here, how we don't have to create this fake Main Street. We have the authentic Main Street right there. So how do these design features get incorporated into what happens there in the future, realizing that some of this is going to go away, but we can still incorporate those elements. The 4 core values. These 4 core values have served us very well as we move through the process. Once again, just walking through what they are. and the desired outcomes from those, whether it be for historical and cultural interpretation, public access, healthy habitats, and economic development. How we, as we move through this process, the things that we've heard that we believe really represent those 4 core values. Acknowledging the work that we've done to date, beginning with preliminary investigations right after the property went bankrupt, through the master planning process, and then the partner's commitment. It is still our goal. So these are really, like I said, these are going to move at 2 different. The land use document will move forward, and the strategic plan will move forward. They're not contingent upon one another, and our goal is to have the strategic plan adopted either by ordinance or resolution by all the partners to really show that commitment by each of these public agencies to this vision and the support for the direction that we're heading with it. Outlining the public engagement process, and then we go into a little bit more detail about each of the values and draw out a little more detail, a little bit description of the opportunities on the site and some of the partners that we've identified throughout the process, acknowledging what the site was and what that history is and how important it is for how we move forward with that site. Acknowledging the structures on the property, especially the ones that we focused on. The D-Ink building, paper machine number 4, Mill O, the Hawley building, and then some of the other secondary buildings that could certainly be utilized or interpreted. There's old flour mill foundation is out there, the old basalt rock walls, the boilers, the digesters, the large sphere, Sputnik, everybody refers to when you walk through the site. So just putting those down into the strategic plan for future reference. And then some of the examples of other interpretive projects throughout the world that have been very, very successful, taking old industrial sites and incorporating them into very productive and very successful redevelopments. The public access component, obviously one of the largest things that had the most support when we talked with the public. Getting folks back along the Willamette River and out to the falls was by far the most supportive desire from the community. And as we've discussed with the partners group, the recommendation from the consultant team and the staff is that the catalytic project, the first step, we believe, should be the Riverwalk, providing that access back along through the property, along the river, and out the PGE Dam. So we are currently negotiating, and we've been negotiating with PG for a while. They're supportive on an access easement across their across the dam out to the falls, as well as we're currently negotiating with Mr. Heigerken for a public access easement across the property that would get us from 99E out to the PGE Dam. We talked quite a lot about how do we access the site, the importance of not only vehicular but bike and ped access ways into the property, really integrating the site with Main Street so that it feels contiguous rather than a gated community at the end of our downtown. And then identifying where secondary site access can occur coming off 99E into the new Water Street, as well as important ped and bike connections, both across 99E and the railroad tracks up to McLaughlin Promenade, and then continuing south along the rail spur towards Kenema and crossing 99 again to tie into those Kenema neighborhood up to the Children's Park into Kenema Bluffs, eventually down to Willamette Narrows. So it does open up significant miles of Willamette River frontage for bike and ped opportunities. Water Street, we think, is an important first step. This is coming right off 99E. We used to have Water Street there. It was platted. And so how do you reestablish that as part of the Riverwalk project? So once again, as we move through these, this is a living document. These are demonstrations. We still need to go through a public process in the final design and engineering, but this is really, we believe, capturing what we've heard as we've gone through this process so that this doesn't get lost if it does take us additional time to do this. And how can we incorporate in the top of this one? You show the existing condition, and then in this example we're incorporating some of the Mill H infrastructure for public access and viewing. It's one option. It may or may not happen, but it is certainly something that could. And then out onto the PG facility, most of you have seen this description of the public access while still incorporating the maintenance requirements of PG to continue to operate that dam facility. Another example, many of you have seen this in Australia, of taking the old industrial oil refinery and storage tank and turning into an absolutely beautiful public park that incorporates many of those industrial elements into its final design. The healthy habitat, you've heard a lot about the several climates that exist, the microclimates for habitat from the mist. So really focusing on riparian habitat, fish habitat, and then water quality. We see all those as opportunities on with the redevelopment of this project. We've identified the areas where that can occur, both above the falls and below the falls on the site. And then the economic redevelopment potential. When we start to look at the redevelopment block. So essentially this is the one component that's going to be adopted as part of the land use document. So in our discussion, since Mr. Heigerken has purchased the property, I would like to point out on block 4 on the map. So originally, we have changed this diagram in discussions with him. Originally, the yellow, let me see if I've got the yellow piece and Mill O, the Woolen Mill Foundation, and it used to come around almost like a little U here. Right. So if you recall out on the site, here's the PG dam that you walk along, and then there's Mill H right here that you can walk straight into. So those foundations of that Mill H is even with the dam. And so in the discussions with Mr. Heigerken was, would there be an opportunity to potentially do something there, since it is much higher than the surrounding area. So we did propose to identify this as a potential redevelopment parcel, realizing that there is quite a bit more work that needs to go into this, as it's in the 96 inundation area, as well as ensuring that we get appropriate public access along the river out to the PG dam. Now, there's 100 ways this can be designed, so it's not to say that development will happen here. It's saying that we will look at it in the future, because we just don't know right now what the opportunities are there. So that is the one change that we have made that's
But this
that's
gives
significant.
him the opportunity to develop if he wants.
It gives him the opportunity to try to design something that could
Okay.
comply with our code and
Okay.
still meet the intent of the master plan. Yes. And if you recall, with the discussions we've had about this, in this hatched area where Mill O is and the Woolen Mill Foundation, it always was this hatched because it's right on that
Yeah.
edge of being in the 96 flood, but then transitioning into what we know is where the private development should occur. And so
Right.
we've always said we need to take a closer look at this. So we've just expanded that for the lot 4 there. The demonstration plans, so you've seen several of these showing from taking most of the infrastructure out to leaving a lot of the infrastructure in place, but really emphasizing that there's always a way to provide public access through the site out to the falls and then continuing south down to Kenema. We're considering preparing a demonstration plan D, which would show that option that I just described on lot 4. Of what that could look like. So we are planning to potentially add a demonstration plan C. Here we talk about some of the initial work we've done on the opportunities for economic investment in the property, as well as the potential jobs and tax revenue generated through a full redevelopment of the site. We've got several scenarios and assumptions that we had to make in order to come up with our numbers. So this is the justification for what we assumed, both for the economic impact for tax revenue, jobs created, as well as trips generated from the site. So that all that methodology and thought process is there for anyone to look at. And then realizing the vision for the property. So we talked a little bit about not only acknowledging what we've done to date, but we've taken and then extended out in the public access, the infrastructure, the public spaces, and the redevelopment. And this is going to be an ongoing effort. We didn't want to get into a situation where we said public access had to come first or infrastructure had to come second. Some of this will happen concurrently. Some of it will require us to identify funding and plans, but we'll have to wait until the private side's ready to go. So we didn't want to insinuate that you had to do one before you could start the other. All 4 of these are probably going to be moving along at different paces. But right now the proposal is to really focus on the Riverwalk development and try to identify that funding, for the design and engineering and then the construction of that. We will certainly be continuing to have conversations with Mr. Heigirken on all the other aspects of redevelopment of that property. And the main reason for that has really been the catalytic value that a world-class, well-designed Riverwalk could provide to the property. We've used that as the example several times in Minneapolis with Mills Ruin. I believe that the public investment, obviously much different scale, much larger, was about $320 million along the Mississippi River for that public access green space, which resulted in $3.4 billion in private investment on the backside of that. So once again, that was very quick. I know you have seen most of this. A couple of things I do need to talk about. We currently have another Hatfield Fellow that's working with us on the project. Metro was able to get them involved, and they're looking at best practices for starting a friends group on the property. We see a nonprofit part of this as very important. It could help us very much in raising funds, being the pass-through on projects for grants if we need a nonprofit to serve that role. So you may have, as we've sent out questionnaires, a survey to folks, so you may see that pop across your email. So that's what we're trying to accomplish there, is to get an understanding of how would we form this, how could it function, what would folks be interested in, so that we can start setting that up to get that going sooner rather than later. We are also working on a Riverwalk memorandum of understanding between all the local agencies to identify, essentially what we're trying to identify is, what are the goals of the Riverwalk, and so that when we start to go and negotiate those, there's no surprises in the end. Essentially we want agreement among the public agencies, one acknowledging that the Riverwalk first is the right step. It's a catalytic value of it is worth investing in. Starting to assign, are there certain components that, whether it be the state or us or the county, need to have in order to move forward, that we know that up front and those expectations are there, so we don't negotiate a deal and then have someone come back and go, well, that's not good enough. So we're really trying to identify those things up front. And then we are going to be bringing that back to the partners group on July 28th to begin those discussions on that memorandum of understanding. And we're still negotiating on having the land use sign. We hope to have that done here very soon, with potential hearings probably looking at September, October of this year.
Nice.
Very good.
Say again, land use what?
We're negotiating with Ms. Heigirken to get the land use application signed. As the new owner, we need his signature. So we've been working with his consultants as well as our consultants to address some of the outstanding questions and just clarifications that they have, and bringing them up to speed on what we've been doing for the last 3 years.
For probably about a month and a half, our team has just had a fire hose of information at this owner, and so he's been
information overload.
Has he been conscious during all this?
It's been a lot, but I think I really feel we've come a long way, and we're really, really close. But it's
sort of glazed.
Yeah, he's pretty good. I think he understands a lot, but we just, when you spend 3 years on something, there's a lot of background information to pass on.
And he's been very good. We continue to have our tours out there. He's been very good about providing us access to the site. And we're actually, for the First City Celebration on July 26th, we will be running tours out there in the morning and then having a booth again as part of the festival.
Tony, how are you going to address parking for the Riverwalk? I didn't see any reference on the plan on-site parking or.
Yep. The parking discussion is going to be something that we continue to have. We think that for interim uses, you can park the site in an interim basis. That is one of those items that's going to move concurrently. Of the way the plan's written is, we've demonstrated how you can park the site parcel by parcel, but that requires the parcel to be constructed. So what do you do in the interim basis, or does a parking structure come in early that then gets paid back as the new buildings come in? So we need Mr. Heigirken, to kind of we have to have those discussions still. There is a way to park it with a structure, and so it's, what role are we going to play in that? What role is the county going to play in that, if any? What role does Mr. Heiger can play in that? So
Would that be a revenue-producing structure?
I think that at this point we're still, it's preliminary. I think that there's multiple ways to structure the construction and payment and revenue associated with that, and so I think it's finding the best one, because that's only one component of probably obvious costs going into the property.
Great. You have anything else for us?
Just a quick question. I noticed on your slides you had 95% draft,
Yes.
so I was looking on here. So this is the 95%?
Yes, just the PowerPoint that Tony's showing was the draft that Walker Macy used for the partners group, and what you have in front of you incorporated comments we received from the partners.
Thank you.
Very good.
Any other questions?
One more. Are we approaching this as a concept plan like we did the South End concept plan? Is that the same principle involved, or are we taking a different tack here?
Well, I know there's been a lot of public input, I know.
Yeah. Well, for the land use document, it is somewhat like a concept plan, but it's also a master plan, as there's going to be specific conditions. There's going to be a new zone written. So we kind of approached it, the public engagement aspect of it, as if it were a concept plan. But essentially we are identifying development standards. So we are providing some more certainty and description than you would see in a typical concept plan.
Okay, all right.
We're utilizing our master plan, concept master plan code, approval code, and that's codified in the municipal code to walk through this.
Well, this thing being a moving target like it is, I think you guys have done a magnificent job. I really do.
Yes,
Thanks.
absolutely.
It's unbelievable.
I agree.
Okay, thank you very much. So our joint work session